Tomorrow morning, an alarm is going to go off. You'll get up, get ready, and spend the next 8, 9, maybe 10 hours working, then commuting, then errands. By the time you sit down and actually rest, the day is basically over, and you'll do it again tomorrow and the day after that. You probably assume that's just the human condition. That life has always been this relentless. That before supermarkets and grocery delivery, ancient humans must have spent every single waking hour in a desperate, exhausting fight just to survive until sunset. Here's the part that doesn't add up. When anthropologists actually went and lived alongside hunter-gatherer communities, the last living windows into how humans spent their days for hundreds of thousands of years, they found something that contradicts almost everything we assume about ancient life. These particular people weren't working themselves into exhaustion. They were working less than you. So if they weren't spending all day fighting for survival, what were they actually doing with the rest of it? Let's start with the morning. There was no alarm, no clock ticking on a wall. The day began when the light did, and for most tasks it ended long before the sun dropped. Nobody was staying late to finish a project, because there was no concept of late. There was only daylight, and what you chose to do with it. And what they chose to do, according to decades of field research, was surprisingly little. In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee spent months tracking exactly how the hoansi people of the Kalahari spent their time. He expected to find a population living on the edge of starvation, grinding through every daylight hour just to eat. Instead, when he actually clocked their subsistence work, hunting, gathering, and food preparation combined, it came out to somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week. 15 to 20 hours, less than half of a standard modern work week. It wasn't a fluke. Later studies on other hunter-gatherer groups, including the Hadza of Tanzania, found strikingly similar patterns. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes described entire afternoons where adults simply weren't doing anything you'd recognize as work at all. So the real question isn't why ancient life was supposedly so hard. The question is, what filled the rest of the day? Part of the answer is food, but not in the way you'd expect. Contrary to the man the mighty hunter image that dominates our imagination, in many of these societies it was gathering, done largely by women, that provided the bulk of daily calories. Roots, nuts, berries, tubers, dug up and collected across a few steady hours, not an entire day's ordeal. Hunting, meanwhile, was often the complete opposite of reliable. A hunter could walk for hours, track carefully, throw everything he had at the effort, and still come home with absolutely nothing to show for it. Meat was valuable precisely because it was rare. A bonus round, not the daily grind survival actually depended on. And when a hunt did succeed, something happened that modern instinct finds almost baffling. The meat wasn't hoarded. It was shared, often across the entire camp, following unspoken rules everyone understood. Not out of pure generosity, but because sharing today meant being fed tomorrow, whenever luck ran out. It was insurance, built directly into the social fabric, which means the picture flips entirely. The steady work was short. The dramatic, uncertain work was occasional and communal. And that left something modern life almost never leaves behind. Spare time. A lot of it. So what do you do with spare time, when there's no television, no phone, and the sun is still hours from setting? You rest. Midday, especially in hot climates, was often reserved for exactly that. Lying in shade, dozing, waiting out the worst of the heat. This wasn't a guilty break stolen from productivity, the way a modern nap can feel. It was simply an expected part of the day. The same way lunch is expected now. You maintain relationships. Long stretches of the afternoon went into something researchers now consider absolutely critical to human survival. Even though on the surface it looks like doing nothing at all. Talking, grooming, gossiping, fixing a tool while chatting with a neighbor a few feet away. Some researchers, including anthropologist Robin Dunbar, have gone as far as arguing that this constant social chatter, this endless small talk, may be one of the actual reasons human language evolved in the first place. Not to coordinate hunts, to hold the group together. This wasn't wasted time. This was the glue keeping small, fragile bands of people from falling apart. You teach almost without noticing you're doing it. Children weren't sent away for 8 hours to learn in isolation from adult life. They followed along, shadowing grown-ups through the actual business of the day. Watching a spear get carved, a root get identified, a fire get coaxed back to life. Miniature tools, scaled down for small hands, have been found at ancient sites, meaning children were practicing real skills through play long before anyone called it an education. And there's a piece of this puzzle that's easy to miss entirely. Grandmothers. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza noticed something odd. Human women, unlike almost every other species on Earth, often live for decades after they stop having children of their own. Why would evolution allow that, if it didn't offer some advantage? The answer, known as the grandmother hypothesis, is that older women weren't retired. They were often some of the most productive foragers in the entire camp, gathering steady food and freeing up younger mothers to care for infants. Their labor may be part of the reason humans can afford such long, slow childhoods at all. Grandmothers weren't a side character in ancient daily life. They may have been one of its engines. There's also the question of movement itself, because this is where the picture gets even stranger. Foragers did walk, often several miles a day, following food and water across shifting terrain. But it wasn't the deliberate gritted teeth exercise we associate with fitness today. It was unhurried, woven into the actual task of gathering or tracking, stopping constantly to dig, to talk, to rest in shade. There was no separate category called exercise, because movement wasn't something you scheduled apart from living. It simply was living. And status worked differently too. In many of these societies, anthropologists documented something almost the exact opposite of modern ambition culture, the kind that rewards bragging and self-promotion. A successful hunter who bragged about a big kill wasn't admired. He was mocked, sometimes deliberately and harshly, by his own camp. Researchers call this practice insulting the meat. It sounds cruel out of context, but it served a purpose. It kept any one person from feeling superior enough to hoard, dominate, or stop sharing. Egalitarianism wasn't just a nice idea. It was actively, constantly enforced through humor and social pressure, which meant nobody was working themselves into exhaustion trying to outperform the group either. Even leisure had a visible, physical footprint. Archaeologists have pulled ochre pigments, shell beads, and carved ornaments from sites tens of thousands of years old, objects with no survival function whatsoever. Decoration, self-expression, things made purely because someone had the time, the safety, and the inclination to make something beautiful, instead of merely useful, purely for the sake of it. That's not the signature of a species clawing desperately at survival every waking hour. That's the signature of a species with room to spare, and the imagination to fill it with something other than work. It's a strange thing to picture. An adult life with maybe 15 or 20 hours of real obligation a week, and the rest given over to rest, conversation, teaching, craft work, art, and each other. But here's what makes this more than just a historical curiosity. Researcher Marshall Sahlins looked at data like this and coined a term that still unsettles people today: the original affluent society. Not affluent in wealth, in the way we usually mean it. Affluent in time. He argued that hunter-gatherers weren't poor and desperate at all. By the simplest possible measure, hours spent not working, they may have had more genuine leisure than almost anyone reading this sentence right now. And more recent research backs up a piece of this that sounds almost impossible. Anthropologist Herman Pontzer measured the actual daily energy expenditure of the Hadza, using modern tracking methods, fully expecting a population that walks and forages all day to burn dramatically more calories than a sedentary office worker back home. The numbers came back nearly identical, not because hunter-gatherers were secretly lazy, because the human body, it turns out, adapts. It doesn't simply burn more the more you physically move through a day. It compensates elsewhere, quietly adjusting other systems to keep total energy use surprisingly stable. The wild, physically punishing image of ancient daily life may be, in calorie terms, not nearly as different from yours as it looks. None of this stayed perfectly constant, of course, and it would be a mistake to imagine it did. There were lean seasons, droughts, stretches where food was scarce and everyone worked harder and worried more. Ancient life wasn't a permanent vacation. But even accounting for those harder stretches, researchers have found that the average, across an entire year, still lands far below what a modern full-time job demands. The hard seasons were the exception people endured, not, as we tend to imagine, the exhausting rule they lived under every single day. There's also a quieter kind of evidence, one that doesn't show up in a spreadsheet. Stress itself, measured through hormones like cortisol, in comparable modern populations that still live partly off the land, tends to run lower than in populations working long, fixed, indoor hours under constant deadlines. Less scheduled obligation seems to come with less of the low, grinding background tension that so many people now treat as just a normal part of being alive. So somewhere between the campfire stories, the midday naps, the grandmothers gathering roots, and the unhurried afternoons of tool repair and gossip, a different question starts to form. If ancient humans, without a single modern convenience, could fill their days with rest and connection instead of constant labor, when exactly did we decide constant labor was the natural way to live? It wasn't ancient humans who invented the 8, 9, 10-hour day. Agriculture was the first shift. Once humans settled down to farm, food no longer arrived through a flexible mix of foraging and occasional hunting. It arrived through planting, weeding, watering, and harvesting on a strict seasonal schedule that didn't care whether you felt like resting that afternoon. A field doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care that you're tired, or that the weather turned, or that you'd rather spend the afternoon talking with a neighbor instead. Skeletal evidence from early farming communities even shows a measurable decline in health compared to the foragers who came before them. Shorter statures, worse teeth, more signs of chronic physical strain, more food overall, enough to support far larger populations, but harder, longer, more repetitive hours to get it, day after day, with none of the built-in slack that foraging life allowed. Then came industry, and the shift went further still. Factories ran on clocks, not sunlight. Shifts stretched long, because a machine doesn't get tired the way a person watching over it does. And for a long time, nothing forced employers to consider whether a person should. Work stopped being something woven into the rhythm of daylight and rest, and became something measured in fixed blocks, sold by the hour, disconnected entirely from how a body actually wants to move through a day. And somewhere in that transition, exhaustion quietly got rebranded, first as normal, eventually, almost as virtuous, as if being constantly busy were proof of being a good, worthwhile person, rather than simply proof of a system asking more of you than most humans, for most of history, ever had to give. Tomorrow, that alarm is still going to go off. You'll still have somewhere to be. That part isn't changing, and this isn't a suggestion that it should, or that any of it is easy to undo. But maybe, just for a second, when you're staring down another 10-hour day, wondering why simply existing feels this tiring, it's worth remembering that for most of human history, this exact kind of exhaustion wasn't the baseline of being human at all. It wasn't what a day was supposed to feel like. It was the exception, a strange, historically recent detour, and somewhere between the fields and the factories, we simply forgot which one was real.